My name's Bob Israel, in case you didn't know. I primarily design sets and sometimes costumes, and mostly for opera. Oh, here come the hordes, millions of more people. Hurry, hurry! You won't get a seat unless you come right away, or you won't get 3 seats unless you come right away. Let me just say that, believe it or not, opera is compared to painting and sculpture and music and dance a relatively new form as we know it today. In fact, the first all these noises in the world that never 25,000 years ago, there were no noises except for wild animals and people with gas. That's all it was. The opera, as we know it, was really invented in Venice, Italy, around 1600, just about the same time that Shakespeare was writing his great plays. The idea of putting acting and dance and singing all together consciously was a new idea. They existed separately, but putting them all together to tell a story is a relatively new idea in the West. And the first great opera composer was in Venice, and his name was Claudio Monteverdi. He was really good. One of the great advantages we have today is we really know what these things sounded like. Mostly sound just kind of evaporates into the air, but we actually know what these pieces sounded like when they were played because they were written down, and we still have the instruments. So Monteverdi wrote a number of really wonderful operas. I just want to play you the beginning of one of his operas so you can hear what it sounds like. We're going to put on Orfeo, just the beginning, track 1.
Great.
Hear it? There aren't really any strings. Or if there are strings, they're not carrying any of the melody. Basically horns and winds and drums. This was probably played in the Doge's palace on the 2nd floor to an audience maybe only 2 or 3 times bigger than this audience. This is the beginning of it. We'll just play it until you hear the voice. All the parts were taken by men, just like in Shakespeare's plays at the time. What's really interesting about this is you can feel the sense of time that's different than our time. Now, this is sung by a woman. This is a contemporary recording. It normally would have been sung by someone, a man who was very unfortunate by today's standards. He would have been castrated, castrated, so that when he was a young man, he would have never gone through puberty or gone through it with great regrets. And his voice would not have changed if everything worked out okay. Of course, being castrated in the 17th century had its dangers because of not knowing what infections could happen and could die. So opera is a relatively new form. Monteverdi, I'll tell you the story of one of his early operas. It's a great, great story. In an opera, the story is called the libretto, as opposed to a musical where it's called the book. His opera Il Combattimento di Tancredi and Clorinda. Clorinda is the battle of Tancred and Clorinda. It's about, there are only three people in it. There's a narrator and two dancer performers. One of them is a Christian knight, the other is a Muslim knight. And in the beginning, we see the two knights enter onto the battlefield. Obviously, this is the Crusades, and they're going to have a terrible battle. The Christian knight, and this was a big sensation at the time, came in riding a horse. And now this was on this, if any of you have been to Venice, they had to raise a horse up into the second floor of the Doge's palace in a sling, and then Tancred came in with a sword, riding a horse, and of course this was a great surprise to the audience. And then he dismounted, and it was all done very formally, and then they had a fight. The fight was interrupted by the narrator, and every once in a while the two knights would fight, and they fought supposedly, metaphorically, for days and weeks and months on this battlefield, on this heroic battlefield. And finally, the Christian knight mortally wounds the infidel. And the Muslim knight falls on the ground, mortally wounded, and asks the Christian knight before death to bring some water. And Tancredi goes off the stage and comes back with his helmet full of water for the dying knight, and takes the dying knight's helmet off, and it's revealed that it is his true love. Metaphorically, it's a very beautiful, simple story, not to be thought of in any realistic terms, but to be thought of in kind of wonderful, universal terms. This was a time when there were incredibly sensational paintings and stories that were written. At the end of his most famous opera, The Coronation of Poppaea, the last scene is a beautiful, beautiful duet that a man and woman sing over a man's body who they've killed. So they murdered. So this is, you know, this is nothing that there's nothing new even in Breaking Bad. It was a sensational opera, and the duet at the end is incredibly beautiful, and that's how it ends. There is no moral to that story, except some people sometimes triumph. let me show you, where's my briefcase? Before I show you some slides, I'd like to show you technically what goes on. Oops. You guys know what a section is? For those of you who don't know what a section is, if you take a building and cut it through from back to front, like you were cutting a cake, and then divide it, you can look in and see a section from the front of the stage to the back of the stage looking left, and the front of the stage to the back of the stage looking right. This is a section of the opera house in Paris, the Bastille, which has, I think, the biggest stage of any opera house in the world. It only seats 1,600 people, but the stage is gigantic. The front stage is probably in feet, 90 feet deep and 85 feet across. And then back of that, and then below that are elevators, so that you can slip that stage back and raise 3 elevators that would bring up a set for another set. Those elevators are on the same pattern as the aircraft carrier Foch, so you know it's big. It could lift planes. Yes.
Do you mind speaking to the mic?
Oh, here, yes, I can do that, sorry.
Maybe you could come to this mic?
Okay,
So you don't have to
sure, okay.
Yeah?
Yeah,
We're
sure.
trying to record it.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. Sorry. And the, in back of that stage is another stage that is that size. And on either side of the front stage is a stage that size. And in back of those 2 side stages are stages that size. And underneath it all is a whole area where sets can be reassembled and then brought to the middle stage and raised up while the front stage slips back because it's on air casters. In other words, one person could move it, but one person doesn't move it because it would start drifting, so 3 or 4 people move it. And this is a section. So here's, yeah, can you hold this? Okay, thanks. Here's the orchestra pit, and here's the front stage, okay? And these are all the pipes that are above, where you can bring in different lights. And all of those lights and backdrops and anything else you would care to bring in, these are all electric pipes with lights on them. Here is the beginning of the audience right here. Does anyone have any questions about this? It's pretty big. In fact, the first time I entered onto the stage from one of the sides, I didn't know what direction the audience was. That's how big it is. I mean, it's just gigantic. Okay, let's... Each construction has a drawing. This is, you can't tell what this is, but Each construction is drawn by, everything that's on the stage is drawn by me or an assistant, and then redrawn by the opera company. This is a plan of a section of the floor for Covent Garden, for the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden. One of the confusing things for an American is in England, stage right and stage left are the exact opposite of what they are here, and in France, they're court and garden. So I have a book at home of all the different, in 7 different languages, of all the different terminologies that are different from one country to another. This is a plan of the set that I did at the Bastille. A very complicated set. This is looking down at it. And you can see this is the front stage, and here's the continuation of the back stage and all kinds of other stuff that isn't on here. And here is the audience here. Any questions about this? It looks intimidating. It really isn't, because a theater is, a proscenium theater is only a simple Newtonian machine for making things go up and down, back and forth, and any other direction you might want it to go, according to weights and counterweights. So all of this is just a matter of articulating things so that you can move them in this room that is actually a big box. Okay?
Bob, I had a question for you.
Yes.
How accurate do your drawings have to be at the preliminary step and your assistant's drawings before they then get taken up by the theatre company and fitted into pretty much like an architectural schematic?
I have to provide them with drawings that are accurate. I can make mistakes. They're there to correct the mistakes and to tell me how things don't exactly work in their theater. And then we can make adjustments after they've looked at my plans. Does that? I should be accurate. I don't have to, I always make mistakes. Sometimes the mistakes are small, and sometimes I haven't anticipated something with their theater. So generally speaking, they're all, there's a give and take always. I'm really only responsible for what things look like from the audience's point of view. I don't have to be concerned about the mechanics. So I don't have to draw the back of anything. I should know if it will work in their theater, but I don't have to put down the specifics of how it will work. I'm not good at that at all, but I can make it look like I want to. Plus, I always provide them with a model, and in a while I'll show you some models. And I usually say, build from drawings, don't build from the model. But I do both because drawings drawings are flat. It's okay. And they tend to lie in comparison to having a real three-dimensional object in front of you. Let's look at some, let's do this now. This is going to take a second because the files are big, I guess. Can we turn this out here? The first thing you're going to see is a long time ago. I've worked a lot with composer Philip Glass. Uh, we're actually working on an opera now together that's going to open an opera house, a new opera house in Linz, Austria, based on a play by Peter Handke, who's a very important Austrian writer. The things you're going to look at from the mid-'80s, the second opera that Phil wrote called Satyagraha, which is about Gandhi's formulating of his ideas on what he called militant nonviolence. The images may look vague because they're behind a gauze, a scrim, which gives them a distance and allows them to be hazy. Okay. Look at all those fonts. Can we do the first? Well, do the first one. The set to this was very simple. It's a truncated, what you might, a truncated obelisk in the center of the stage with a man sitting on top. In this particular scene, it's Tolstoy, and this is the beginning of Gandhi lived on a farm in South Africa for 10 years where he formulated his ideas, and this is, I didn't have anything to do with those images that just came up. And this is where he published a newsletter and also used a printing press after a while, and as you can see, the image is hazy, is fuzzy, and the opera has a kind of quality of distance about, whoops, that's from another opera. That's from Wagner's Ring Cycle in Seattle. And if you, whoops, okay, go back, go back. Wow, oh, they're loading. This is more recent. Should I wait for a minute?
You're okay now.
I'm okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, it was just loading all.
Okay, why don't we look at the second image? Okay, there's the printing press, and you can see it suspiciously looks Indian in its coloring. And this actually worked. It spewed out publications. This is also from the first act of the opera. How many of you are familiar with Glass's music? Okay. Okay, next. Oh, this guy is actually wearing a costume. This is the third opera that Philip Glass wrote called Akhenaten, and that's a bodysuit. It was very strange. Akhenaten had a terrible disease, which, if you look at the period that Akhenaten lived, you see sculpture with the royal family had extended craniums. Did you ever see those Egyptian things? It was actually true. There was a very strange, as you can see, his head is elongated, and he has he had what I guess we would call women's hips and breasts and undescended testicles, which is not something you often find in opera. This guy is wearing, or anywhere else on the planet, hopefully. This is a bodysuit that he was wearing. I designed the sets, and I'm proud to say I designed his costume. He actually, once he got into this costume, he didn't get out until until the evening was over, and it's a long opera. It's about 4.5 hours, so he had to do any form of elimination before he got into that costume, and it's very strange. People said, well, if it's a costume, where's the seam to get in? And I told them, he swallowed the costume. That's how he got into it. No, he actually, there was a zipper underneath his sweet little testicles that he crawled, that stretched, and he could get into that and then pull the legs and do this contortion and get into it. It's really ingenious, the people who made this. Let's look at, and this was about Akhenaten. This was an opera at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. It was commissioned, it's another Philip Glass opera. It was commissioned, this is Columbus Day. It was commissioned for the something anniversary of the discovery of America. And here, and that's the full stage with the image behind. The room is suspended in midair, and here is all pixelated, is not pixelated in real, is Stephen Hawking's suspended in his wheelchair. This was the beginning of it. At the end of this scene, the room split into 4 different pieces and flew off into space, and Stephen Hawking's was there in space, suspended in his wheelchair with the rings of Saturn and the moon in front of him. The important thing that a designer of opera has to remember is there's a narrative, there's a story, and what the designer does is help articulate the story visually. You can't just do anything you want. You have to work in collaboration with the conductor, who in this case was James Levine, and the director, David Pountney, who I worked with a lot, and the composer, Philip Glass. Let's go on to the next one. This is another shot. You can see how simple the stage is there. Another shot of Satyagraha. Let's go on. You see how it's all hazed. It's not a particularly, these aren't particularly good slides, but all the same, it gives you a really good idea of what's going on. They're building a farm. And this is, again, the last scene in the first of 4 operas making The Ring Cycle by Richard Wagner. This is the last scene in the first opera. As you can see, if you look carefully, here's a deer, a horse, a dead, incredibly fat woman, and the whole thing is breaking out into fire. Here's a big duodecahedron. This is real fire, actually. This too big table with another duodecahedron on it and fire here. And a backdrop that is coming off of its frame. This is probably the most complicated, the 4 operas, probably the most complicated single work of art in Western culture. It lasts about 16 and a half hours over four nights. The first opera is the longest one-act opera. It's 2 hours and 45 minutes, just the one act. So if you have to go to the John, you better go before the opera starts, or you're going to be in bad luck. This was another opera at the Met, a Czech opera by Lajos Janáček, a wonderful, 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 wonderful composer who isn't as well known in the United States as he might be. just opera for opera is probably the greatest opera composer of the 20th century. And this is the first scene in an opera at the Met of his. Here's, if you look, this is a rehearsal, and here's James Levine. Very simple set. A house in the front and two other buildings in the back and big sky. Any questions so far? None? Where are we? This is one I'm not particularly fond of. So let's go through these faster. 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 Okay, this is the front curtain for an opera by Richard Strauss called Die Frau ohne Schatten, The Woman Without a Shadow. It's a fairy tale, and it can be a little scary because it's about a woman who does not, a goddess who doesn't, she doesn't have a shadow, which is means she can't have a child. There's something missing from her, so she doesn't have a shadow. And her nursemaid tells her she should go down to earth and take the shadow from a woman on the ground, take it away so that she can have children. And this was the front curtain in, where was this? This was in, where did I do this? In Zurich, which is a wonderful place to work. And there's the front curtain again, but it was on a scrim, and you can see part of the set through the scrim. It's the same image and actually painted the same colors as this, except projected with other colors. And then the image projected over the painted surface, so you get a dimensionality that just eludes the audience. Next. This is a scene from The Woman Without a Shadow. This is the evil nursemaid. She was fantastic. And a messenger with his long cane, which is moving there. And he's actually on stilts. And those are planets. This is a room where supernatural things happen, and the planets are suspended with their shadows. Well, some of them have shadows, and some of them don't have shadows. Next. Lighting is really important. As you can see, you can pinpoint the lighting so that things change wonderfully. There usually are hundreds of lights that allow you to side light or specifically pinpoint what's going on. Next. This is the beginning of the final scene. I won't go into the story because it's quite convoluted in this other land where children who have not yet been born live. It's not that they're dead, it's that they're not alive yet in another kind of world. Next. Next. And there again, back is the messenger, and here are some of those not yet born kids. Next. This is an image, that's also from that last scene. As you can see, you can do all kinds of things with shadows and lights. Next.
Was that painted on the dress?
What's that painted what?
Is that?
Oh, you can't see it very well here. It's a skeleton.
It's painted on the dress?
It's painted on her gown, yeah. Lots of kids. And a falcon right there, yeah. And that falcon actually had a lot of red in it, but with this casting these blue lights, the red kind of goes away. Next. Next. There's one of the kids, a little scary there. Next. There's the nursemaid. She was a wonderful actor, just a wonderful actor. And very tall, about that tall. Next. There's the messenger. That wallpaper, I gave them a sample of what I wanted, and they silk screened all the wallpaper. Next. Next. She's bad. Next. And there's the falcon up on top of the room, and the empress who wants the shadow. This isn't a good shot. Next. See, the lights in different positions will allow you to create. Those long lines are actually, because behind each of those spheres, the spheres are each in front of, the sphere is in front of a rod that's holding them to the wall. And those are actually lights that are lighting up the spheres, the shadows of the rods. Next. There's that head again. All kinds, it becomes very disorienting. And the colors were all over the place, intentionally here. Next. This is an earlier scene in a, you have to figure out how you're going to move the scenery. There are a lot of different scenes. So this is kind of parenthetical. It's a scene within a scene with a juggler. Next. There are the kids. Those were big fiberglass molded heads that were on children who were, they didn't sing, they just kind of moved around. It didn't matter what they did when they moved around moved around the stage. They were so creepy. They were the creepiest actors, and all it was kids just kind of walking around like that. But with those macrocephalic heads, they really looked bizarre. Next. There they are. How'd you like to find those in your bedroom when you go home tonight? Next. You can see why do they look so big there? Oh, these were adults. These were adults. At one point, the kids became bigger, and the audience couldn't figure out what happened, and really all that happened was these were adults. And this is an opera that was written right before the First World War, but because of the war, Strauss did not have it premiered until, I think it was 1924. And so it has a kind of romantic sweep to it that you would find at the beginning of the 20th century. And
You caught someone.
I coughed. Okay, next.
Your phone is calling someone.
Okay. I'm getting a new phone. Okay. How do I oh, I know, I can, wait a minute, I can turn it off. Okay. Next. This is an opera which takes place in the future, and women are not very well thought of. They're all wearing these uniforms. Next. And there is one of them in a very religious setting in the future. Cloying, to say the least. Okay, keep going. You can't see these next few. Okay. Next is another Philip Glass opera that takes place in a room in a small theater. So let's go through these quickly. These were written by David Wang, who's a Chinese American. And this is, stop. This is another opera in Zurich by a composer, Lear, who, this is the last scene of the opera. We won't go on to it. It's very romantic and has very little good music in it. Next. Okay, this is the second act of Tristan and Isolde, which takes place, it's a very simple story. It's a very long opera. It's a very simple story. It's an incredibly great opera. And the opera is about a man and a woman who take what they think is a death potion. It turns out to be a love potion. And in the second act, they sing a very long love duet. And it takes place in this ethereal world. And just when the love duet is supposed to climax, someone comes in and interrupts the scene, and the last note is not, it's not consummated. And it doesn't, we don't hear that last note until the last note of the opera. And this is that part of that duet. What's very difficult about directing this opera is in the second act, nothing happens. Nothing happens. And so we had a stage that's a turntable, and the act is about an hour and 40 minutes, and the only thing that really happened was the turntable made one rotation in that period of time, and the set and lights changed. Next. You can see, yeah, there's a different angle on it. It's a very complicated set, as you can see. And this was a set that was impossible to draft. And so, again, this was in Cologne. This was in Cologne. Because I couldn't draft it, and because they couldn't draft it, I had a model, and they built all the pieces, and then I went over there and we placed the pieces. We had to pay attention to the fact that people who were singing this very difficult music had to move on the set. They had to finally, at the end of the love duet, get up to this door and seemingly enter into another transformed place. And then the set revolves to its other side, and like all good operas, he's stabbed. So it's really great music. It doesn't get any better. It's also, Wagner's operas are quite long. Next, you can see there the woman was who played the lead, and she was really quite a wonderful performer. The music is so hard, so hard. Next, there she is in part of the set, passing. You see, you can really articulate light so beautifully and have things change in many, many ways at the same time. Next. 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 It's pretty complicated stuff in terms of building it and lighting it and directing it. Next. This is the only other character who is in that scene before the guy gets stabbed, and this is that other woman's maid. Next. This is from the Santa Fe Opera. It's Benjamin Britten's Turn of the Screw, which is from a Henry James story. Have any of you read that? It's a ghost story. It's a wonderful ghost story with all kinds of erotic, somehow the operas I do all seem to have some kind of, maybe it's operas, have this erotic background. Lots of ghosts. As you can see, there's lots of junk on the stage and lots of shadows, and sometimes you can't tell a shadow from a person, and people are carrying these pieces of trees, which make the scene even more complicated. It's actually a very simple set. Next. This is a scene from an opera called The Fiery Angel, which is a Russian symbolist story that Prokofiev set to music, and that's a mad alchemist, his scene. This weird 10-minute scene that seems to be one huge climax. Next. There's another Philip Glass opera. This was done at done at Harvard at the American Repertory Theater. Also, again, you see how important lighting is. And all there are those uncompleted flats, they're called, and that chandelier, and people being just the light that reflects off the floor, lighting them in a kind of intentionally imprecise way. Next. Okay. Let's look at, are there any questions? Wait a second. No questions. Let's look at this, okay? Any questions? Yeah.
A lot of what you're doing in stage design seems different than a lot of art media where you're making something that goes on a wall or that's a sculpture that's freestanding, and that you're making something and then putting it in an environment and then casting light on it. And how did you come to this, I guess, basically, and what are some of the steps you took in your training to be able to conceive of this multidimensional sort of process?
Yeah. Okay. It's actually a really good question, and my answer is really strange and idiosyncratic, okay? I guess I had a difficult, this becomes personal, difficult childhood. And what I really wanted to do, I think, underneath it all, was to escape from my parents. Not physically, but at least in terms of my fantasies. And I always drew pictures. My father was a doctor. He was in the Army. And my mother was a Jewish housewife who wanted to become a princess. And they weren't particularly interested in their son. And one of the ways I was able to escape from that environment was to do things that were relatively benign, like listen to classical music and listen to operas. And I knew my parents wouldn't stop me from doing that because they knew it was the right thing to do, in parentheses. And so in the beginning of high school, I started listening to a lot of music that was very difficult and foreign to them while I continued drawing. When I finished graduate school in painting, I moved to Minneapolis, where I taught. And I had a show of drawings at the Walker Art Center, which is was physically connected to the Tyrone Guthrie Theater. The Walker put on operas at the Tyrone Guthrie Theater, even though the configuration was not particularly conducive to putting on operas. I had the show of drawings. The director of the Walker liked the drawings, and two things happened. One, the director thought that I should design one of the operas that they put on at the Guthrie, which were designed by only by artists, because the Walker put it on. And the drawings were seen by the Whitney Museum, and if any of you have been to the Whitney, I was asked to have a show at the Whitney. The opera I did at the Walker was, for some bizarre reason, reviewed on the front page, the big article in the Sunday New York Times. And it was a really good review. I had the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. I'm glad I did, but it's bizarre, because I didn't know what I was doing. I think the designs were pretty good, but I had a lot of help from a good friend who was the director. A lot of help. And I was fortunate enough to learn on the job. I was asked to do other things. I was asked to do other things with this director, and I learned what I was. There is a kind, because opera is such a complicated form. And by complicated, I mean all these things have to come together. An orchestra, let's say an orchestra with 56 pieces. Singers, the singers act. They have to be at the right points in the light. They have to be able to move on the set. The set has to be acoustically conducive to singing on it. The designers have to work with the director. There's a chorus. All these things have to come together at rehearsals, and things have to be built correctly, corrected. I was fortunate enough to learn on the job, and I didn't know certain things that I was supposed to do, which was a great advantage. Does that answer? Yeah. I think the second thing I was ever asked to do was at the Netherlands Opera. And from there, I guess that was, they thought it was a good design also. Somebody here had a question? Yeah? That shows how important school is. Yeah? I don't care. I prefer to work with a good opera. The chances are that a new opera is not going to be a good opera. But I think I've been very fortunate enough to work with Philip Glass, and we're good friends. I've worked with other composers, and it hasn't been much fun. I just like working with people who are sympathetic to each other's ideas. That's what matters. I've done a lot of 20th century stuff, but I've done 17th century things too that are just as exciting. The thing to remember is that you're putting them on in the 21st century, which is different than putting them on in the 17th century. So you have to think about who you are relative to the music, relative to the direction, not who I want to be in the 17th century. Did anyone else have a question? I wanted to show you some of the, this is part of a set for King Lear, which isn't an opera, as I imagine you know. Can we have the next one? There's the other side of that set. The next one. This is a model, by the way. The next one. The next one. Next one. Next one. Oh, these are balloons in a mock-up for the Children's Hospital. I was asked to do the sculpture in the Children's Hospital because I'm a theatrical designer. They wanted a theatrical designer. The Children's Hospital at Johns Hopkins, which opens this April. And so this was a mock-up in very rough form with balloons, so we can see what the ostrich would look, kind of what its volume would look like. It's huge. It's 26 feet high. Next. Stop. Go back. That's the room from. I don't know whose arm that is. Oh, that's in the shop in Zurich. This is the room that scene took place in The Woman Without a Shadow. And this room actually was sitting in another room on the stage, and this room elevated, revealing the other room. So you can see we're drawing on, we're putting where the other planets went, we drew on the model. Next. There's a similar room. Actually, this was a bed. It doesn't look like a bed there, but it's just a frame for a bed in that same room that had different cladding on it. Next. And that's the model for that room with all those creepy kids. This is the third act. Next. Oh, this is in fact upside down, but it doesn't matter. This is another opera by Wagner called Parsifal, and there in the second act there's a huge tower that's 4 stories high, and maybe we'll see it in another view. And at the very end of the second act, it sinks into the stage, the whole tower. Next, there it is. This part faces the audience. This is the side, and it's being painted in the shop. You can see the painting is quite wonderful. They had me come to see it, and that's not the whole tower. That's only two stories. I liked the painting, but I told them it wasn't dirty enough, so they made it messier. Next. There it is, those 2 floors. It sunk in 4 seconds, 4 stories, with someone standing on the top story. Next. This is part being constructed in a scene shop of a scene in an opera called La Juive, which isn't performed very often, for good reason. Next. There's the other side of it. Next. Next. You can see the shop is just clean as it could possibly be. This is the wood shop. It's not, there's a metal shop, a painting shop, a prop shop, an upholstery shop, and then the costume shops. Next. Next. There's a couple door knockers they were working on. Next. This was the first act of Tristan and Isolde. This is the model. Next. There's that part of that scene being painted. Next. There's the model for, actually that guy's too big, for the second act of Tristan. Next. 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 That didn't happen. Remember there's a children's hospital, and So this is the only sculpture that's outside in front of the hospital. A big rhino. He's to the top of his horn is about 14 feet. So you have to watch out that kids can't climb on it. A kid would only be about that big. So there's no way for them to climb on it. Inside, you can't have them touch anything because of contagion, runny noses and things like that. There were all kinds of problems with working in a hospital. Next. Big mouse, big yellow teeth. They were afraid, this has been eliminated because they were afraid the kids would get scared. You have to deal with doctors too. Next, big red eyes. Oh, there's 3 different variations. Actually, what eventually happened was the little rhino is now on top of the big rhino. Next. There's a first iteration of a cow. They were concerned about the udder because the cow was suspended jumping over 28 moons, and they wanted the udder to blend in more with the body of the cow, because kids would ask what that hemisphere was on the bottom of the animal. Actually, it amused me. I've had a very good time working on this project. Next. It's the only time I've ever done anything like this. There's the cow, and you can see, if you look very carefully, something yellow. Next. That shows you how big the colors got changed. How big, that's the hospital. It's going to be, I think, the biggest children's hospital in the world. It's 14 stories just for children. Next. That's a rejected armadillo. Next. Next. Oh.
Might be the end on it.
Is that the end? Any questions now? There's the full. This is two images put together for King Lear. You can see they don't exactly fit, but you can figure out what. And there it is in my studio, just sitting on a table. When there's that terrible storm, if any of you are familiar with King Lear, there's this huge box that a refrigerator was in, that just a cardboard box that got all soaked from above, and we had to have a new box each performance because it just got all wet, and the water cascaded down here, and we had a gutter down here to catch it. If you remember King Lear, Gloucester has his eyes poked out, and I think when people say they don't like to see violence on the stage, the most violent line, I think, in all great theater is in King Lear. When Gloucester has one eye poked out, the next line is, "And now the other." It's a pretty violent line. Next.
Must be bigger files.
Let's dump this, and let's put the just get rid of it, and we'll put this one in, and this will be the last thing we'll look at. Just this one. Any questions? No? Yeah? Yeah. Yes. Uh, I don't understand the question exactly. You mean, do I have to change what I intend? Yeah. Oh, that should have happened. Well, the the higher up you get in the theater or opera world, the more those things are taken care of up front. And in the best houses, they want to give you exactly what you want. In the worst houses, they want to be as lazy as they can get. So in these productions, they've always wanted to one thing happened in Zurich that's never happened before. The technical director came up to me at one point and said, "Bob, don't worry, we've got plenty of money." That's a strange, Well, that's Zurich. There are banks that give money to the opera company, and there are pharmaceutical companies that give money to the opera company. So it's an incredibly rich city with an incredibly rich opera house. And that's not true in the United States. Opera houses are in deep trouble here, but in Zurich they're not in trouble. And the people who work there, the people who work in Zurich are they're either from Switzerland or Germany, and they're really meticulous, and they do beautiful, beautiful work. And what they want more than anything else is to be challenged. If you challenge them, it makes them smile. So the idea of having a room that settles inside another room was more like, oh goody, let's see if we can do this one. So that was it's really a great place to work. And it's just the right size also. It's not, I mean, they do a huge number of operas, but they've got a lot of people working there who can do the work. They build 16 new productions a year, which is unreal. And I imagine each production, the budget for the sets and costumes has to be at least $1.5 million, $2 million. So they're in good shape. This is, can we turn those lights out again? This is in the prop shop. We can go through these quickly. This is in the prop shop, and they were building, you can see the little, this was a model for those heads, and there's the falcon's head that they were working on, and some drawings. There's a beak there. Next. Those spheres. They're pretty spherical. You remember the human eye? This is the paint shop. Look at the floor in the paint shop. There's no paint on it. Well, there is on this thing. But it's clean. The human eye is very bad after about 15 feet. So you can see the gloss on the paint and the number of coats this has been given. It gives it a kind of a dimpled effect, but that's not seen from the audience. It looks like a perfect polished sphere. Next. 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 There's the image I gave them of that front gauze curtain. They were measuring it, and you can see everything it's like it's as clean as a hospital in there. Next. 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 There's one of the floors that they're painting. Next. 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 It's wallpaper. Next. Next. There's, we didn't see that in the other. I asked them to put an antelope on top of something. So this is, they're working on the antelope. Next. And that's, they went to a butcher so that they could check the, this is hanging in one of the scenes. No, this isn't, but they divvied up the meat, I think, after this. It's a wild something or other. I was shocked when I saw it, actually. It wasn't killed for the production. Next. 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 A kind of a ill-formed falcon inside an egg. Next. 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 There's the front gauze. Next. Part of another scene. Next. Okay. Okay. You guys have enough? Thank you for coming.